Barsetshire in pictures. What I hope to suggest is how an attentive gazing at the original illustrations of Trollope's Barsetshire novels, as well as the scenes in the two more or less faithful film adaptations of Barsetshire that still exist, make visible elements that unify the Barsetshire series. That these elements were intended by Trollope is suggested by the evidence in his letters, that Trollope chose the subjects for illustration whenever he could, and when he didn't like an illustration or illustrator, he let others know about this. Many of us are familiar with Trollope's concluding resonant peroration to the last chronicle of Barset, where he tells us Barsetshire was a single real world for him. In this county, he and I together have wandered often through the country lanes, and have ridden together over the two well-wooded fields, or have stood together in the cathedral nave listening to the peals of organ, or have together sat at good men's tables, or have confronted together the angry pride of men who are not good. I may not boast that any beside myself have so realized the place and the people and the facts as to make such reminiscences possible as those I should attempt to evoke. But to me, Barset has been a real county, and its city a real city, and the spires and towers have been before my eyes, and the voices of the people are known to my ears, and the pavement of the city ways are familiar to my footsteps. It's a place real and imaginary, peopled by characters known to Trollope and us. Trollope himself mapped it. We are looking here at Trollope's own mapping. The problem with staying with this is the palaces also manifest this minimum of a linked, real, imaginary place and recurring people. So we must go further and ask, what, if anything, distinguishes the Barsetshire books from the palaces? Trollope again tells us in this coda. In these books, his object has been to paint the social and not the professional lives of clergymen. Some have understood this statement to mean Trollope separates off religious life and doctrine from a churchman's social life and politics. Others say no, and that religious attitudes coming out of social class and character psyches are included. But after a while, most concede a distinguishing feature of Barsetshire is a dramatization of how in England a clerical vocation and career and set of values works out. But wait, Dr. Thorne, which we read here and is the fourth Barsetshire book, doesn't tell any story of clerical lives, even though it's the first book which allows us to map East and West Barsetshire. So too the small house at Allington. Mr. Harding turns up only once in the small house, and his character and story, as then revealed to Adolphus Crosby, have, ironically to be sure, no discernible effect on Crosby, except to prompt the competitive thought, the Allington turf was better than that of the hospital. Yet the vignette for this encounter is among Millay's most striking for the book. Let's look at number 2. Mr. Crosby meets an old clergyman on his way to Courcy Castle. 116 years later, in the BBC Barchester Chronicles, there are 4 shots remarkably close to this, of which we'll look at one. Let's see number 3. We see Donald Pleasance seen from on high, a zoom shot looking like a tourist wandering around the cathedral. This is one of my favorite shots in the series. It's common to think the incident and vignette are there in the small house to link it to previous Barsetshire books. There is, however, another anomaly. Allington is not inside Barsetshire. Granted, Courcy Castle, where Crosby is headed, is first mentioned in Dr. Thorne, and repeatedly in Framley Parsonage as a corrupt place which Lady Lufton abhors. There are also no original sets of illustrations for the Warden, Barchester Tower, or Dr. Thorne to help us out in our quest to find unity. And Millay's famous 6 for Framley Parsonage are all indoors or allegorical. 4 do anticipate many illustrations for the last chronicle by George Huseman Thomas by showing us characters in moments of intense hurt or anxiety with people and furniture that are very ordinary, middling, or low status. Just one example. Let's look at number 4. We see Mark and Fanny Robarts just as the bailiff and his men are coming in to make an inventory of the furniture prior to removing it to pay for his debts. Mark, she said, the men are here. The heroine shows a patient strength seen in other Barsetshire heroines. Again, fast forward, this time 155 years to 2015, and we find a Dr. Thorne movie shot far more outside than indoors. We have continual green and pleasant lawns, maybe too many establishment shots of Courcy Castle, Vauxhall Hill, and the Thorne residence at the end of Greshamsbury Street. Frequently, too, we see Tom Hollander as Dr. Thorne walking home through what seems a main village thoroughfare. So too Stephanie Martini as Mary Thorne. Let's look at number 5. With a basket of things she is giving away, her strength, like Fanny Robarts, is seen in her ability to endure and yet carry on, seeing to the needs of others while she is being ostracized. Harry Richardson as Frank Gresham joins her, and the very walls romantically spout red flowers among the ivy. Twice with a kind of comic bravura, we are with Ian McShane as Sir Roger Scatcherd, walking down these streets too. In one tracking shot, let's look at number 6. He is at first buoyant in the morning light. Then he grimaces in a purse-faced expression as he canvasses the place where he is about to give a campaign speech. Very picturesque streets they are too. The use of stone bridges repeats the townscape of the 1983 Barchester Chronicles, but no scenes inside and around churches in this Dr. Thorne, and no major clergymen. In addition, 4 of the books, Dr. Thorne to the Last Chronicle, feature as major characters very non-clerical lives and worldly themes, including elections, sleazy artists, and London crooks. Undeterred, writers have turned to subjectively perceived parallels and underlying perspectives. Casebooks and essays on individual books tease out evidence for this feeling many readers have had. There is unity here. For this talk, I'm building on a 1971 book, Hugh Hennedy's lucid and enjoyable Unity in Barsetshire. One parallel event he thinks important repeatedly and centrally occurs when a male career is at stake. A hero resigns a post over a principal. Not just Mr. Harding 3 times, but Mark Roberts and Mr. Crawley too. Those male protagonists who cannot get themselves to refuse status or money are often punished, especially when the case involves bribery, cheating, or debt. 2 examples from Bramley Parsonage, Mr. Sowerby, and as we seen the Small House, Adolphus Crosby. I add the Trollope's favorite moral heroes who help create contented endings do not have as their most actuating motive in life the accumulation of money and rank. Francis Arabin and Dr. Thorne explicitly, Johnny Eames all take pleasure in and are proud of jobs well done for the sake of the work and their self-esteem. Henry Grantley is rightly angry because, tempted by his father, he gave up his career on the understanding he would always be supported by his father, and finds himself blackmailed by a threatened loss of allowance if he should marry Grace Crawley. Lily yields Crosby to Lady Alexandrina without a venomous act, word, or even wish. My argument is the Barchester books constitute an English-inflected, fractured, pastoral idyll. To me, they're patently not fairy tale because they hold to probability and verisimilitude. In telling of the original inspiration for the warden, Trollope stressed an idyllic inspiration, a walk that became a creative reverie, because maybe it did matter to him more than the literal church corruption case the warden is based upon. He had been setting up postal routes in Ireland, where the conditions were so dire that the assignment in Salisbury seems to have triggered intense relief. Whilst wandering there one midsummer evening around the purlieus of the cathedral, I conceived the story of the warden, from whence came that series of novels. Sorry, I apologize. Came that series of novels of which Barchester with its bishops, deans, and archbishops was the central site. So for the rest of this talk, I'll show that the pictures drawn by Millais for the Small House by Thomas and by Millais for the Small House by Thomas for the Last Chronicle, and the characteristic mise-en-scène of the BBC Barchester Chronicles help sustain and reinforce the parallel thematic patterns while providing pastoral surroundings. Paul Goldman and David Skilton have invented the term bimedial text to indicate the full meaning or experience of Trollope's novels as printed at the time were ideally meant to be an interaction between the reader's imagination prompted by text and pictures across a book. In these 2 sets of pictures and 1 movie, we'll observe an interlace between vignette or letter and full-page illustrations can create for the readers a richer, more interesting, and unexpected experiences than the text alone. First, I found it a surprise to discover that out of 18 full-page illustrations and 19 vignettes or letters, in the Small House at Allington, there are only 2 of Lily close enough for us to see her face. In the other 7, she's either at a distance, facing away, or somewhat obscured. Hall suggests Millay was not good at heroines' faces, but this is manifestly untrue. We can look at one interlace. Let's look at number 7. The vignette I showed last time of packed trunks, suitcases, and other stuff actually prefaces chapter 49, Preparations for Going. This melancholy vignette is not of Crosby's things at Courcy Castle, but shows the 3 women's stuff, a lifetime of activities gathered over many years. The match is Lily handing down a found inkstand, number 8. Oh, Belle, here's the inkstand for which you've been moaning for 6 years. The concept is just so believable, even if that's Belle, her hands are not going to catch the inkstand. We see an unnamed servant, one of the countless invisible people of these novels, holding Lily's dress down to make sure she doesn't fall. The text says the squire comes in, but the man is too young and thin-faced. In the small house pictures, Eames does not wear a top hat, but a round one. So it could be Dr. Crofts. The face faintly resembles the one vignette of Dr. Crofts seen troubled sitting on a chair. According to the illustrations, Johnny Eames is this book's central character. He is most often pictured. There are 15 of him, alone with others, full-page vignettes, letters through metonymy, the bull. We follow his story's crucial incidents step by step. There are but 8 of Crosby altogether, and in some he's pictured in ways parallel to Eames, standing hesitant before a door or entrance, wandering in a street. I've mentioned the one vignette of Dr. Crofts. There is one full page for Mr. Lupex with Joseph Cradell and Mrs. Lupex. The 3 look very uncomfortable, but doing their best to be courteous to one another, they are depicted in a dignified, attractive way. The pictures in the small house at Allington seem to me a continuum on which it depicted the problems of men confronted with conflicting social demands of normative heterosexual masculinity, including choice of wife and when, how, and if the male should resort to violence. Again, just one example out of so many, the idyllic last full-page illustration for the small house. Let's look at number 9 to see Johnny with Lady Julia. A gentle step came close to him, and turning round, he saw that Lady Julia was on the bridge. If we needed confirmation, the single study of Lady Julia confirms how favorably the novel regards her. Lily has again refused Johnny's proposal of marriage, and Lady Julia encourages him with the idea he has asked too soon. Her face is too youthful, as is that of Mrs. Dale in the depictions. It's not uncommon in film adaptations today to cast actors and actresses far more attractive and younger than a book calls for. In the 2 full-page illustrations of Crosby, close up enough to look at his face, he occurs with Lady Alexandrina, once buying carpets. Since this is one of the more frequently reprinted of the small house set, we'll look instead at the first vignette to chapter 48, Nemesis, number 10. We see an elegant London street, but when we go inside the lovely facade, we find an uncomfortable, half-quarreling and bored couple who do not even make eye contact. Let's look at number 11. The caption, "Why on earth on Sunday?" The marriage, such as it has been, lasts 10 weeks. The pictures also reveal that what we might regard as a secondary or backdrop story, the mere breakup of the relationship between the 2 houses, is primary. There are 3 full-page illustrations, which include either or both Mrs. Dale and the Squire. The first illustration within the book, frontispiece to the Trollope Society edition, we see her at home with her maid, her face hooded, a glum expression. The facing text is her inward thoughts, and they suggest she's aware she's given up having a life of her own to give her daughters the comfort and dignity of living genteel lives. Here and later, we find her pressured by the Squire to please him on the implicit basis not only should she be grateful, but somehow he should have more say over what her daughters do than she or they do. The second is of Squire Dale, Lord De Guest and Johnny in London, after Crosby has abandoned Lily, where the Squire in the juxtaposed text is feeling guilty when faced with Guest's generosity because he has worked out that it was after his refusal to help Crosby and Lily in any way that Crosby headed for Courcy Castle. We'll just look at the third, number 12. Let me beg you to think over the matter. Her gesture is one of deprecation, and his is one of genuinely trying to listen to her and persuade her. I feel this image favors his point of view. So too the next chapter title, Mrs. Dale is thankful for a good thing. To conclude the survey, Lord and Lady De Courcy's real misery with one another is caught strongly, but just once. Palliser and Lady Dumbello are shown, she distant and strained, he open-faced, again just once. By contrast, Lord De Guest is twice depicted in full illustration, and appealingly, here he is early in the novel with Eames in another pastoral setting, number 13. Why, it's young Eames. This moment of togetherness is fulfilled when in chapter 58, Lord De Guest tells Johnny he can understand grief, but not any outward expression of it, a reinforcement of his sister's advice to Johnny. The parallel here is the book's implicit criticism of Lily. It's acceptable to have been shattered, bereft, profoundly shocked. Her shaming involves the allowed sexual intimacy of an engagement, but not to continue to show it, and not to refuse to forget. The most often printed depiction of Lily is a poor one of her first refusal of Johnny Eames, where her face is a blur and her arm all wrong. The reverse parallel by Millay shows Eames confronted by Amelia, where she demands that he accept her love. Her face is turned away from hers, and his again the focus of a picture. But again, curiously, the woman's body is not quite right. What of Belle, the other sister? She only occurs in pictures with Lily. Their story might seem just another variation on the book's interlace of stories of love and a lack of it, except for the striking beauty of two vignettes of Lily and Belle in a garden, often reprinted. Lily also gets the penultimate final vignette. We see her from afar. Let's look at number 14. She's staring sadly at a vase of flowers used to symbolize matrimony in an earlier vignette. It's called The Last of Lily. It's a very sad picture. Sometimes readings of pictures are Rorschach tests. I see drawn over her face a stiff veil. For my part, I agree with the Earl. I go farther and suggest the reason Lily is so inveighed against by readers today is from the beginning to the end of the book, she persists in breaking an ultimate taboo. She will not be guarded. She will be openly vulnerable. She will not behave performatively. She disquiets people. Her attitude of mind inveighed against is analogous to that of the Reverend Josiah Crawley's psychological state throughout most of the last chronicle. Hennedy singles out disgrace and humiliation as two repeating phenomena throughout the Barsetshire series. This parallel between Lily and Crawley allow us to segue into the original illustrations for the last chronicle and the way the Signora Madeline Vesey Nerone, as played by Susan Hampshire, the female character in Barsetshire Towers who also breaks taboo and has been punished hard, is featured. The last chronicle of Barset, George Huseman Thomas drew an astonishing 32 full-page illustrations and 32 vignettes or letters for 84 chapters, which sustain a continuity of presentation of characters and places verbally and visually. Trollope had tried to persuade Millay to do this work, a story in 32 numbers, which is to come out weekly, saying these pictures won't take you above half an hour each. Millay knew better and refused. Very unfortunately, the whole series is not in print anywhere in any form. You must take yourself to a rare book room in research libraries to see them. Houseman does not have the genius for pictorial depiction found in Millay, and publishers are persuaded, probably rightly, these images would not have much appeal except for a specialist and a true Trollope lover, and there are so many of them. As with the illustrations we saw in Orley Farm, and I mentioned during The Vicar of Bullhampton, and we have now seen in The Small House of Allington, the illustrations can tell several stories with different emphasis from the book than you might expect. We don't begin to have enough time to look at such details, but since there's unity in Barsetshire, we can look at one underlying vantage point and overriding mood. The vignettes and larger illustrations in the first editions of the last chronicle repeatedly picture people who belong to lower or middling orders in Barset, and about daily tasks not necessarily mentioned in the text, or in a troubled mood. Sometimes they set a peaceful mood, as in this mood-setting letter. Let's look at number 15. It's a favorite with me. Lily and Grace suing and talking together by candlelight. The vignette for chapter 9, Grace Crawley goes to Allington. Lily does fine sewing while Grace mends a cloth. Lily is much more luxuriously dressed. We see a plain deal table, a candle, and the dialogue in the book is just below. Let this stand for all these others I'm going to describe. The first vignette for the book is a butcher with a knife. Perhaps he's owed money. The next whispering school children with Mr. Crawley hovering nearby, presumably teaching them. I skip, son, to see males from the parish where Crawley's church stand. The people who crowd into a courtroom where Crawley is indicted. Shacks people actually live in. Post people, one elderly, a farmer. Henry Grantley's earnest gamekeeper, for sale signs. The countryside several times. Women at ordinary tasks in the small house. Breakfast scenes, reading, writing letters, sewing scenes, bidding adieu. These visualize and reinforce the friendship of Lilydale and Grace Crawley in the book. 2 insider room illustrations, a full page of Henry Grantley in what looks like a deathbed scene, but is simply him visiting Mr. Harding in Mr. Harding's bedroom. A vignette of Mrs. Proudie in a posture and dress uncannily anticipating a scene in Barchester Chronicles, where we watch Geraldine McEwen as Mrs. Proudie stalked through a corridor on her determined way to bully the bishop. More citified scenes. A worn-down tavern in a run-down street in Barsetshire with Mr. Toogood glimpsed going inside. People loading luggage on a train. A torn canvas. A London alleyway where a man killed himself. Hook Court. 4 interesting full-page London ones, not bad. Conway Dalrymple trying to sell one of his pictures. A domestic drawing room in which an old woman, Mrs. Van Sieber, I have to apologize again, sorry. I forgot to remove my phone. In which an old woman tells a younger one, you don't know what starving is. One of Mrs. Dobbs Broughton's dinner parties where a number of London characters appear all strained in expression, along with Johnny Eames. The atmosphere is reminiscent of Millet's depiction of Lady Lufton at Miss Dunstable's party, also in London, the figures just as striking. The often reprinted full page where Giles Hoggett, a brickmaker, urges Crawley, it's dogged as does it, which I showed last time as drawn by Francis Arthur Fraser, is utterly in character with the whole Last Chronicles set. Here's just one consummate full-page illustration, one I've never come across reprinted anywhere. For chapter 12, Mr. Crawley seeks for sympathy. This is number 16. The caption is, speak out, Dan. We see Mr. Crawley sitting by a fire warming himself, looking up to a working man who he regards as a friend. Dan scratches his head. Crawley is not behaving proudly here. He's not stiff-necked. The wife is faintly outlined in the shadows by the threshold. On the floor, we see a woven basket, papers, perhaps household stuff. There are probably not enough tables or cupboards in this house. A teapot on a table to the side. Its vignette is a depiction of a Hogglestock workyard, very unprepossessing and yet picturesque. I'll describe one other similar typical pair from this book. Full-page illustration of Dr. Grantley as a large, very well-fed gentleman on a horse, confronted by a gamekeeper with his dogs. The gamekeeper is angry the foxes are not being taken care of properly because Mr. Henry, Grantley's son, is distracted. Then not far off, the vignette of Mr. Grantley come upon a sale sign of his son's property. Mr. Grantley ever so lightly lifts the sign with his cane. It's due to this plethora of pictures that George Huseman Thomas's pictorial work for Trollope's Last Chronicle can succeed in affecting a reader. This is a matter of taste, of course, but in well over 2/3 of the chapters, you come across these pairs. If the 1959 BBC film adaptation of Last Chronicle was still extant, it's one of those early Trollope adaptations wiped out. I assume these images would not hold a candle to that lost production. Nonetheless, since in 4 of the extant videos, there's a close similarity between one or more of the original pictures and a mise-en-scène, it's possible there could have been uncanny closenesses here too. Sometimes a video scene seems to be a copy of an illustration. More often, there's a family resemblance. Take this one from the Last Chronicle of Barset, number 17. We're looking at Mr. Toogood and the old waiter. The chapter is Mr. Toogood travels professionally. A thin, elderly, and deferential waiter is serving Mr. Toogood. The faces are well realized. Mr. Toogood is well dressed, but with slippers on. He seems to be comfortably situated with a hot drink and a carafe nearby. There's a picture of a horse galloping on the wall. On the juxtaposed page in text, he's ferreting out information about the people in the Dragon of Wantley, which information will help to solve the mystery of the 20 pounds and exonerate Crawley. Now let's look again at Donald Pleasance as Mr. Harding in that 1983 Barchester Chronicles number 18. Mr. Harding questions the waiter. We're in London in a hotel catering to clerical people. Here it's a question of the train schedule. How long has Mr. Harding until the Grantleys arrive? Notice the similarity of scene design, atmosphere, the angle, the ambiance. In this case, the vital information that the well-informed waiter offers comes from his having memorized Bradshaw. Let's note also how much better dressed he is, how he has better pressed clothes than that 1867 Dragon of Wantley man. He informs Mr. Harding that Mr. Harding's good friends, the Grantleys, could arrive at any moment now. One of Alan Plater's addition to the Warden and Barchester Towers as Barchester Chronicles is to recognize explicitly that Mr. Harding's goodness is a function of his nature imbued by ideas of Christian empathy. Donald Pleasance's Mr. Harding repeatedly exasperates Nigel Hawthorne as Dr. Grantley by persisting in seeing other people's point of view. Religious and moral feeling play an important role in this BBC adaptation. It opens and closes with a lovely drawing of a cathedral. Let's look at number 19. This still shows superimposed on the cathedral the window of a room where we see someone's cello. No one here needs reminding how much Mr. Harding's cello means to him. An 1855 illustration by F.C. Tilney shows Mr. Harding playing his cello with his pensioners listening, one seemingly in a state of high pleasure, Mr. Bunce, the others a bit more impatiently. Within seconds, this scene widens out to reveal that cathedral close up. Then we see it at a distance, and then it's shrunk back as part of a picturesque landscape. Let's see number 20. We have requisite forest, greenery, and bridge with train, which, however lightly, is reminiscent of other early 19th century watercolors, say by Samuel Palmer. We have time to think about how just one of the groups of characters in Barchester Chronicles are pictured, the Stanhopes, who are a clerical family, though until the coming of the Proudies, the father has lived off his clerical income in Italy, initially on the basis of a sore throat. The younger daughter, the Signora Neroni, has paid her high price for her unconventional behavior. She is crippled for life. She cannot walk. I have 3 images left to share. Let's look at number 21. Susan Hampshire as the Signora Neroni makes her entrance. We cannot overlook this one. There's Susan Edmonston as Charlotte, to me, a non-binary caretaking sister at one side, and Peter Blythe as Bertie, a witty gay male at the other, stage managing Madeline's entrance to Mrs. Proudy's reception, where, as we all instantly recall, the couch itself is weaponized to expose Mrs. Proudy's seething prudery. Numerous scenes in this adaptation take place in Barsetshire drawing rooms. Among these, the Stanhopes, where Madeline, like a dea ex machina, deals out poetic justice, insight, and good fates for all but her brother Bertie, whom once he refuses to lie to the rich widow Bold and cannot marry her, she cannot help. Alan Rickman as Mr. Slope, the dignified Malvolio of this drama, is supposedly justifiably hurt by the Signora, but she does lack the power to kick him out of this ambiguous place. It's Mrs. Proudy who kicks him out. I want to call attention to how Susan Hampshire is typically dressed. Very Barsetshire, I'd call it. Let's look at number 22. Also, let's listen to what she's saying. In the tradition of illustrations dropped into a book, this still would be juxtaposed to the dialogue in the novel, from which Alan Plater, the script writer, has directly transposed into Hampshire's speech. Obstacles to the siblings' plan of marrying Bertie to Mrs. Bold include the heavy mourning Mrs. Bold still wears, about which the Signora has just said, I hate shallow pretenses. I hate such shallow pretenses. I let the world say what it pleased and showed no grief if I felt none. Maybe not if I did. Show it if I did. When her sister and brother remain silent, she continues, you both know in what way husbands and wives generally live together. You know what freedom a man claims for himself and what slavery he would exact from a wife, and you know how wives generally obey. Marriage means tyranny on one side and deceit on the other, and a man is a fool to sacrifice his interest to such a bargain. The tragedy is a woman generally has no other way to live of living. Does such a speech belong in Trollope's Arcadia? Evidently, yes. And I, for one, can only wish Lily had had the strength of Madeline explicitly to cast off the cant of love and marriage. Like Madeline, she doesn't want the choices on offer, and Squire Dale had supplied income enough. When Janet Moore, as the expected Eleanor, comes for her evening visit, the pastoral idyll reasserts itself. Let's look at number 23. Barchester at moonlight. As Bertie sits drawing Eleanor, he seems by his words not to describe the image he is making, but to anticipate the coming talking and walking under the spell of the moon just outside in the night sky. He calls it a landscape, a lyrical scene of great beauty, a magical land where only the pure and innocent on this sad planet of ours are permitted to enter, an enchanted kingdom that bewitches the eyes of mankind. Mr. Slope has come in, and Charlotte remarks, "There is the most wonderful full moon this evening. Do you believe there are beings on the stars, Mrs. Bold?" Eleanor replies, "I feel sure there's at least one man on the moon." Bertie, "But you reject the latest theory from Oxford about green cheese." "I agree. My theory is there are fish on Venus, salamanders on Jupiter, and a highly intelligent form of rocking horse on Mars." And he proposes that they all take a closer look. So we see four of our principals wandering around a bridge for an imagined 15 minutes in the moonlight so as not to leave Madeline alone for too long. I hope I've managed to persuade everyone to consider the idea that the Barsetshire books project a unified imaginary country in characters, which is seen in its many pictures, both in the book illustrations and in the scenes in the movies. Okay, thank you for listening.